Well, good morning, class, and welcome back to Life of Christ. And we are right in the middle of exploring the life of Christ, particularly as it relates to Holy Week. And so our class this morning, we are going to look at the Olivet Discourse. I want to jump right into it here. As I've been sharing with you, just sort of something of a timeline of Holy Week. You remember Sunday is the triumphal entry. Monday is when the temple is cleansed. And again, we could easily say condemned. By the time you get to Tuesday, things really begin to escalate. We saw in our last class in Matthew 23, the collision that Jesus had with the religious rulers and the seven so-called woes, where Christ is standing in the place of an Old Testament prophet, is pronouncing doom, judgment upon the religious leaders. And now this happens as well on Tuesday. We now have the Olivet Discourse. And it's worth just trying to, again, keep these things, how do I say this? I think as readers of the Bible and sort of modern evangelicals, most of us have a difficult time understanding how the Bible fits together, both at a macro and a micro level. We understand there's, Adam and Eve, and then there was like Noah and a flood, and then there's like this Abraham figure, but we have no idea sort of how redemptive history unfolds, so that, in other words, how those events are connected and how they're furthering the redemptive promises of God and displaying his glory. We just have a really tough time doing that. We're very atomized. We miss the forest for the trees quite a bit. And I don't want us to do that on Holy Week, because there's a beautiful forest to see if we would step back and look. And so what happens right now, this is the Olivet Discourse, is something of an exclamation point, because again, as I already said, on Sunday, Jesus has declared himself to be the king. The very next day, on Monday, he condemns the temple, and then Tuesday morning, he essentially condemns the religious leaders with the whole woe is me. And by the end of Tuesday, he is actually going to pronounce the unthinkable, and that is the temple is going to come down. You see, it's one thing on Monday to cleanse the temple and condemn it, and it's one thing on Monday to say this apple is rotten. It's another thing on Tuesday to say I'm chopping down the tree, right? And that's what Jesus does. Now, again, I've said this a couple times in our classes. We have a difficult time, I think, feeling the weight of that, feeling the weight of the tree, not just the apple being rotten, but the tree having to come down, right? And that's because of, as I've said before, we don't have a temple, at least a physical temple that the Jews did in this time. We don't have a particular place. It's not just the religious, but also the kind of sort of economic and pedagogical hub of life. We just don't have categories for this. So, I grasp for words to say that the delight of the temple was second to none. And you can actually see something of that, just aesthetically speaking, when you look at Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. And you find this in Mark 13 and in parallel accounts. What you find is that the disciples are, for all intents and purposes, they're enamored with the glory, the beauty, the sight of the temple. And what's fascinating is that Jesus's words in response, in other words, after the disciples exclaim how beautiful the temple is, Jesus's first words, verse 2, you see all these? You see all these, do you not? Truly, I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So the disciples say, Jesus, look around. I can't believe we're here. I mean, this place is magical. It's beautiful. Like, this is it. We've arrived. And Jesus says, it's all coming down, guys. You don't get it. it's not just Monday that the apple was rotten. This tree is dead. It has to come down. And of course, that's unthinkable. And just like, as I've been sharing with you, again, Jesus is sort of operating in the mode of an Old Testament prophet at this point. He is predicting in the Olivet Discourse, which is the readings that we have are Mark 13 and Matthew 24, and then Luke 21. He's predicting that within a generation, the temple would be destroyed. And not just the temple, but we have to understand the religious leaders, the whole institution that it stood for. Jesus is saying within a generation, this is all going to happen. This is all going to go away. And as a prophet, there is a parallel here. As Jesus stands and prophesies as he does from the Mount of Olives over the temple, there is an Old Testament parallel, and that is the previous temple, Solomon's temple. It had come down centuries earlier at the hands of the Babylonians. And then the prophets would speak of the impending judgment upon the temple and upon Jerusalem. And the people of God scoffed. They wouldn't listen. They had a sort of rabbit's foot theology, and that is, hey, the temple's here, God dwells here, God's not going to let anything bad happen. And God did. And in a sense, Jesus is saying, you guys remember a couple hundred years ago what happened with, well, you don't remember, you've heard about, we all know the stories of the other temple coming down because of the sin of our people and Babylon coming in and destroying everything, judgment. What's going to happen again? It's going to happen within a generation. And it's worth pointing out that that's exactly what happened. Depending on how you date or when you date the death of Jesus, anywhere between the year AD 30 and AD 33, 30 is probably the right date. Regardless, this is the year 30 AD. Jesus says within a generation, it's all coming down. What we know is that in the year AD 70, that's exactly what happened. There was some Roman sieges that took place a couple of years before, I believe in 68, another one in 69, but it was in the year 70 AD when, under the leadership of Titus, the Romans came in and literally to a T fulfilled what Jesus said would happen within a generation. Now, that's fascinating in its own right, but it's also worth just reflecting upon briefly. Well, I don't know if I lost you or not. Things got wonky on my end. I hope you're still there. I guess we'll find out. What I was saying is that, this all takes place in the year AD 70. Jesus makes this prediction in about the year AD 30. Well, he says it's going to happen within a generation. It's common understanding that in the first century Jewish world, a generation was 40 years. So you can do the math. Jesus says that this in the year 30, within a generation, it's going to happen. The year 70, it happens. And so this is all fulfilled just as Jesus said that it was going to be. Now, with that brief little sort of overview of the Olivet Discourse, I do want to take a moment to try to kind of locate this whole thing in redemptive history. And what I mean by that is, and I don't remember if Strauss or Stein, if this is even brought out in your readings, forgive me, but there's sort of various views for how we interpret the Olivet Discourse. And I'm going to give you three main views for how this whole passage of Scripture is interpreted. The first is the Preterist view, and preterist is a fancy word that comes from the Latin, and it means by or past, gone by. And in other words, the Preterist view is the view that would interpret the events, for example, of Matthew 24 as being future from the perspective of Jesus, but being past from our perspective, has already taken place. And so the Preterist would argue that the Olivet Discourse was fulfilled in the year AD 70 when the Romans came in and did the damage that they did. So for that view, Everything that you read in Matthew 24, everything in the Olivet Discourse, it has already occurred. Now, I understand that is, at least in evangelicalism, certainly a minority view. In fact, it wouldn't be surprising if none of you had ever heard that before, and it might sound sort of out there. It's worth pointing out that the preterists can make a pretty strong case from the text for this, not to mention, from outside of the biblical text in terms of what took place in history and the records that we have from eyewitness sources and later writers about kind of what took place with the destruction of Jerusalem. I guess I'll just leave you with this. Throughout Matthew's gospel, he uses the word generation, particularly this generation. And the preterists would lean hard and say, when you read Matthew 24, Jesus says all of these things were going to be fulfilled in this generation. And if you do a little study and you look at every instance of this generation used in Matthew's gospel, if memory serves me right, every example, without equivocation, is referring to the literal generation that Jesus is talking to. And so that's one of the arguments for a preterist view, is that Jesus said this was going to take place within this generation. 2,000 years is not a generation, right? And so the preterist would view these events as past. The second view is the exact opposite. That would be the futurist view. This is certainly, again, at least in broad evangelicalism, this is certainly the most common view. And that is that not only was Jesus prophesying something that was future from his perspective, but it is still future even from our perspective. And so there are a lot of evangelicals that are looking forward to drama, not looking forward, I shouldn't say it like that, expecting these things to be fulfilled in the future, sometime in a literal Jerusalem, in a literal temple, in the literal Middle East. Another view, and that's worth exploring, is, for lack of better words, the already not yet view. And so what they're going to do is say, well, the Olivet Discourse has parts of it that are preterist and parts that are futurist. They're going to say there are some parts of the Olivet Discourse that have already been fulfilled, preterist, but there are some that are not yet fulfilled, that are still future. And how these things, how the already not yet view sort of differentiates which goes in which, bucket is not always, the exact same for those guys. Generally speaking, the already would consist of things like the tribulation, false Christs, wars, persecution, apostasy, and then the destruction of Jerusalem. Generally, they would say that all is already. That was fulfilled in the year AD 70. And there's still some things, though, that have not yet been fulfilled that are future, and that would be things like the Great Tribulation, the second coming of Christ, things of that nature. I bring these things up to you because I think it's an opportunity for a healthy exercise. And the healthy exercise is something that I'm going to call theological triage. These differing views regarding the interpretation, the timing of the Olivet Discourse, provide us with an opportunity to extend charity with one another, especially with those whom we may disagree with. So you might come from the opinion or a denomination or a congregation that holds to a preterist view or holds to a futurist view. And it's at this juncture when we can, we need to do triage, and we need to think through how we disagree with one another about particular doctrines or how we interpret text. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I don't know if my internet on my end is, obviously it's on my end, is just like really wonky or what, but it seems like it keeps cutting in and out, which is strange. So anyway, yeah, it gives us just, how do we think through this? And so I'm going to give you a couple categories, 3 of them. You can see them on the screen. When we're thinking through this and how we disagree, and what are hills worth dying on, what defines, what is definitional and foundational, etc. I'm going to give you these 3 categories. There's the Christian category, the church category, and the charity category. And here's what I mean. There are certain doctrines that are so definitional to Christianity that you can't be a Christian and not adhere or affirm those things. So for example, and these were, you would find this would sort of be like Apostles' Creed type of Christianity. Things like the triune nature of God, the deity of Jesus, the substitutionary death of Christ, his resurrection from the dead, our standing before God being based upon grace alone through faith alone. Those are fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. So you might be a really nice guy, you might be really moral and be successful and whatever, but if you don't believe that Jesus got up from the dead, physically, bodily, then according to Paul, you're still in your sins. Like, you're not a Christian. Or Galatians 1, if you preach any other gospel other than the gospel that I proclaim to you, whether it be an angel or of light or anything, anathema to that person, Galatians 1. So my point is there, 1 Corinthians 15 is another, I'm thinking of a first couple of verses there where Paul says, I delivered to you as of first importance that Jesus died according to the sins, that Jesus died in accordance with the scriptures, and that he rose from the dead on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And so the point of first importance, the point is there are doctrines and truths and realities that are essential to the Christian religion. And you deny those things, you're no longer a Christian. The danger here is that some evangelicals make every single thing the thing, right? We have to avoid the temptation of, majoring on minors. We have to avoid the temptation of making molehills mountains. And so not everything is a first order issue. We have to do triage, right? If somebody comes into the hospital, you got two people that arrive in an ambulance at the same time, and one has, bleeding from their neck or something like that, and the other, I don't know, has cut their toe, they're going to take the guy with the neck wound first. They're going to do triage. There's things that are more important. So those things are first order issues, are things that define Christianity. Then there's things that I'll just call like church order issues. Doesn't mean they're not important. They are. There are doctrines that unite local congregations. So for example, will our congregation baptize babies or believers only? Will we ordain women to the pastorate? Will we have a congregational or Presbyterian model of church government? And we could go on and on and on and on with these types of things. I bring up the issue here because those doctrines, we can agree to disagree on those. You might be persuaded that the Bible teaches that you should baptize infants. I might be persuaded that the Bible says that baptism is reserved for those who make a credible profession of faith. Well, Baptists don't look at Presbyterians as if they're not Christians. And Presbyterians don't look at Baptists as if they're not Christians. These are not first order issues. These are not definitional to the Christian religion. These are not salvific in that sense. Again, doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that they're not the most important. And so we have to have a category for things that we believe that make us Christian, and then things that we believe that make us a church. And those are not always the same. And then finally, we also have to have a third category, and that is charity. So there are things that not just Christians will disagree on, but even Christians within a same church will disagree on. So for example, to come full circle, I think that you could have a church where you've got members that hold to a preterist view of the Olivet Discourse, and you've got members of a church that hold to a futurist view, and you've got members of the same church that hold to an already not yet view. I do not think our interpretation of Matthew 24 is something that is, in the category of you must believe this to be a Christian. Nor do I think it's something that's in the category that defines a church where we need to have like our preterist church and our futurist church. I think actually this is an opportunity for Christians of the same church, members of one another, to exercise charity, to love one another, to bear with one another, to forgive one another, to think together with one another, and to wrestle through these issues. And again, stuff that goes in the charity category are legion. Everything from, should we homeschool our children, to how do we vote at the next upcoming election, to how do we interpret the Olivet Discourse. These are all issues at which we should have charity with our fellow brothers and sisters. And so I hope this has been helpful for you. I wanted to use the Olivet Discourse as sort of a springboard to just sort of broach some of these subjects and help you think like critically and clearly in your own local church context. So hope you've been helped. Hope you're enjoying our walk through Holy Week. I'll see you guys next time.